Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us bright and early. It's great to be back with all of you, noting there's some familiar faces out there on YouTube and a lot of new guests joining us as well. I'm Julie Akers, Executive Associate Dean with the WSU College of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. For those who have not joined us before, we started this research series back in 2021 to share and highlight our research with community members. We did this virtually during the pandemic, and we learned that many people liked the early morning format. Because of that, we decided to continue this series virtually. Our goal is to provide you with an opportunity to learn more about the research that is happening, not only right here in Spokane, but across the WSU system. Our researchers are making important contributions in so many fields. Studies of research range from sleep and performance to addictions, to cancer, chronic disease, and neurological diseases. The list is extensive. Most importantly, all this research is looking at complex and life-changing problems that will ultimately enrich the quality of life for all of us. Speaking of enrichment, some of our guests are enjoying a good breakfast, 40 of whom were fortunate enough to receive a breakfast box, which has become a tradition for this morning's series. These boxes are available to our guests, courtesy of our Wake Up with Research series sponsor, Alaska Airlines. So a big thank you to Alaska Airlines for your ongoing partnership. Before we introduce our speakers, I would like to share our land acknowledgement of America's First Peoples. Washington State University acknowledges that its locations statewide are on the homelands of Native peoples who have lived in this region from time immemorial. The university expresses its deepest respect for and gratitude towards these original and current caretakers of the region. As an academic community, we acknowledge our responsibility to establish and maintain relationships with these tribes and Native peoples in support of tribal sovereignty and the inclusion of their voices in teaching, research, and programming. I also want to touch on what got us here. Washington State University is a land grant university, and the way we serve our state in the health sciences is through education of the state's future workforce, service to communities and organizations that serve our healthcare needs, and research that works to improve the health and well-being of every resident in Washington State. Referencing this statewide approach, we note that WSU Health Sciences research is being done across the state of Washington and beyond. In looking at this slide, you can see all of our clinical sites and partnerships across the state in both rural and urban settings. Okay, so let's get to it and hear from our researchers who are ready to share about their roles and research that brings innovative ideas and practices to those in our rural communities. I want to remind all of you that you can submit any questions you may have for our presenters in the chat section of your screen. We'll be monitoring these as they come in and address the questions at the end of our presentations. We have 3 presenters today, and we're going to start things off with Dr. Angela Stewart. Angie is Associate Dean for Rural Health and Director of the Yakima Operations for the College of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. She's going to share her work on improving access to pharmacist care in rural communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's really an honor to be here with you today and to have an opportunity to share the work of our College of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences Rural Health Initiative. Before I kick things off, though, I do want to recognize co-leaders of the initiative, which include our moderator, Dr. Julie Akers, and also Dr. Megan Underberg, both from the College of Pharmacy. And again, we comprise the leadership team for the initiative, and I really couldn't do any of this work without their help and support. All right, so why are we talking about rural health and rural pharmacy services in the College of Pharmacy? And this map illustrates some of the foundational needs. So this map shows all of the counties in the state of Washington that are considered health profession shortage areas for primary care. And I think it's obvious, you can see that except for that I-5 corridor, there are members of our communities across the state, that are struggling to access primary care services. In addition to struggles to access those physician-provided, nurse practitioner-provided, and PA-provided care services, many of these very same communities are also struggling to access the care provided by pharmacists. So this map illustrates what we call pharmacy deserts. And these are communities across the state in which members must travel more than 10 miles to access pharmacy services. And we recognize that transportation and that mileage is a significant barrier to access to pharmacist care. So with those needs in mind, we recognize that and believe that there is an opportunity to better leverage the care provided by pharmacists in order to help close some of those primary care gaps. And we also recognize a need to develop more sustainable business models to help keep our pharmacy doors open. So this slide describes some of the primary care as well as the traditional services that pharmacists can provide. So of course, the traditional prescription services, dispensing services is vital, and we must ensure that our communities have access to those services. But we're also focusing on growing some of the other care services that pharmacists can provide that can help improve both health and wellness outcomes across the state. And those include services focused on managing medication therapy and ensuring that patients are receiving the best possible outcomes from the medications that they have been prescribed. So with all of this in mind, the College of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences in 2022 kicked off its Rural Health Initiative. And within this initiative, we have three primary objectives or goals. The first is to create pathways into health professions education and selfishly into pharmacy education for students from rural communities, because we recognize that students that come from those communities are much more likely to return after graduation and after licensure to provide care there. We are providing specialized education and training for a select number of students that join us in the rural health training track. Again, we recognize that practice in a rural community requires some additional and some specialized training and skills. And so we're providing that specialized curriculum to those students. And finally, we're working very hard to continue to advance pharmacy practice in our rural communities. So building out those services beyond the traditional prescription services to provide enhanced service to the community, care to the community, but also, again, those sustainable business models. The Rural Health Initiative team has woven a research priority throughout all three of these primary goals or priorities, and I look forward to sharing now some specifics about that with you. So we're in a process right now of strategic planning, and part of that strategic planning is to identify our specific and our primary research objectives. As a foundation, we are relying on information from the Rural Healthy People 2030 initiative. In the most recent update of that initiative, there have been 5 key health priorities identified for rural communities, and those include additional attention and care for members suffering from mental health and mental disorders, priorities related to managing addiction and substance use disorder, improving access and quality to care in our rural communities, focusing on obesity and overweight, and then finally impacting rates of drug and alcohol use and misuse. Again, if we think back to those services I described, those beyond dispensing services that pharmacists can provide, we believe that those align very well with those Healthy People 2030 priorities. And again, further demonstrate that there's potential for pharmacists to step in and really improve care access and quality. So one of the places where research is really highlighted within the Rural Health Initiative is in our rural training track. Each student that's accepted into that rural training track is expected to complete a longitudinal capstone project. We pair them with a pharmacist in a rural community. They go through a process of identifying needs within that community, and then they develop and implement a solution or collect some additional data or whatnot in order to begin addressing that solution. Our first cohort of students is just winding down their training with us and preparing for graduation, and they are wrapping up their capstone research projects. I'd like to highlight just a couple of them here. One student, really interestingly, is exploring whether or not it makes sense for a pharmacist to partner with a fire station, a community fire department, in order to provide enhanced access to telehealth services. Again, recognizing that many communities in rural parts of the state really struggle with good internet access and Wi-Fi access, and perhaps those fire stations could be their local hotspot for receiving that care. A second student is exploring barriers to access to care for farm workers that have high-risk health conditions. Again, I think we can all understand that those barriers can be significant. Our second cohort of students is busy actually conducting their capstone projects right now, getting ready to implement and collect data. And just one example to highlight here is a student from the coastal regions of the state who is exploring barriers in access prescription drug coverage for his local rural community where he grew up. So again, trying to understand better what keeps rural residents from accessing the most ideal or the most optimum prescription coverage and insurance coverage to meet their needs. Our faculty are also actively engaged in research related to demonstrating impacts pharmacists can have on filling those rural care gaps. So again, highlighting some of the work of Dr. Julie Akers. She recently published a study that demonstrated that pharmacist-provided care for minor ailments and conditions is high quality and cost-effective. And we hope that we can demonstrate that that may lead to decreased utilization of expensive emergency department services, for example. And Dr. Underberg from our Rural Health Leadership Team also recently published results of her work that demonstrated that a pharmacist-led interprofessional team can have positive outcomes or positive impacts on medication therapy outcomes in members of a rural community. And she focused that work up in the northeast part of our state. Although we are focusing our efforts on impacting the care in Washington state and improving quality and access in our rural communities locally and regionally, we recognize that this is not just a Washington state problem. Obviously, there's great interest around the country to explore how pharmacists can do more to fill those gaps in access to primary care. And we're really excited to share that the WSU College of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences is one of the founding members of the newly formed Rural Pharmacy Consortium. And this consortium has multiple goals, but one of which is to provide opportunities for national collaboration in research projects related to rural health. So this is, like I said, this consortium has just formed and is just beginning their efforts. So I look very much forward to being invited back soon, and I'll have more to share with you at that point. So thank you very much for your attention this morning, and I will stick around for any questions at the end.
Thank you, Angie. The research you, your team, the Rural Health Initiative pharmacy students are doing is so fascinating. We appreciate all that you've shared with us, and I know firsthand how important the work you're doing helps our region. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Sterling McPherson. Sterling is Interim Vice Dean for Research and Professor at WSU's Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine. Dr. McPherson will be presenting his research on experimental technologies and therapeutics to serve rural dwelling people with substance use disorder.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for that, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to be able to go give your talk after other people at WSU have given theirs, because you're able to see a lot of the great work going on elsewhere, and I already can see some areas where I can follow up with Dr. Stewart about ways we can work together. So I'm going to be talking about some of the work that our group has been doing over several years, and I'll be talking specifically about some of the technology developments that we've been working on to combine with evidence-based therapeutics so that we can serve people in rural areas. So before I get started, I always want to give my disclosures. I have consulted for a number of biopharmaceutical companies. I also consult for Providence Healthcare and the District Attorney of Eastern Washington. Most of my funding, though, has come from the NIH, as you can see, and any potential conflicts have been mitigated, and nothing related to any of these relationships will be reported on today, other than some of our work that's been funded by the NIH. The other thing I always like to do when getting started is make sure to give credit where credit is due. Even though I'm the one here talking about this work, the truth is it's a team sport, and there's a ton of people, as you can see there on the screen, that that I'm very fortunate to work with, and they're the ones that really make this research go. So one thing that we have been wrestling with at WSU since I got here in 2010 is, why should people dwelling in rural communities not have equivalent access to the same high-quality treatment for substance use and other mental health disorders? And there on the right, I'm not expecting you to read all of that. It's just an example of a recent special issue that was published in Addiction Science and Clinical Practice that I was able to be co-editor on, where we asked this question and really asked for papers that would dive into this more. How do we most efficiently, most cost-effectively develop therapeutics that can be delivered in rural locations? Do we develop those in urban settings and try to export them? Or do we start out doing it in rural communities and then try to expand it? These are all questions, not to mention, how do we get those evidence-based therapies out there, right? How do we develop them to be portable? And so what we found in our work is that some of the key ingredients for a successful therapeutic that can be delivered to rural communities is that it requires technology, requires reliable internet, it has to be portable, and this last one I underline because it has to be uncompromising effectiveness. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of us know that there are lots of apps. You've probably been bombarded with advertisements for things like ways to lose weight and ways to stop smoking. And there's an abundance of apps that will tell you that they can improve your health. Most of them are garbage. Most of them do not have evidence behind them. And so this notion of uncompromising effectiveness, what I mean is that it must be evidence-based. One of the methods of treatment that our group has been involved in for many years is something called contingency management. And if that top right graphic looks confusing, please just ignore it. That's just so that if my postdoctoral mentor happens to be watching, he will be glad that I actually include some of the core basic science that supports this therapeutic. But the basic idea behind contingency management is relatively straightforward. The idea is that we are trying to displace the use of alcohol, cigarettes, methamphetamine, opioids with an alternative source of reinforcement. And that is to say, a gift card or money, anything that is that is consistent with a non-substance use or with a substance-free lifestyle. So the typical sort of example is that people come into the clinic, if they test positive for alcohol, then they don't get a voucher. We say, hey, nice try, good job. Don't let this be too much of a deterrent. You're still working hard. Come back and we'll be able to give you your gift card if you're able to get back on the horse. If they test negative, it's congratulations, keep up the good work. And those gift card vouchers are given in an escalating fashion. So if you get $2 this week for every sample that you submit that's negative, next week you may get $4 per sample. So a question I get a lot when talking about contingency management and hearkening back to that statement that I made right at the beginning, that we have to develop therapeutics for rural communities that has the same bar for effectiveness that other therapeutics have. And so an obvious question is, what's the evidence base for contingency management? And I can tell you that it is very, very strong. Contingency management's been around for at least 30 years now, perhaps longer. It started out in the laboratory with animals, was then experimented with humans, and has now become, in some places, entrenched into clinical care. That's actually something that parts of our group are working on. I won't speak to that today, but the whole implementation and dissemination of contingency management is sort of the next phase. So I know that this is a mess, and that's intentional. This is to show a couple of things. Number one, that we at WSU have become an international leader in this space. Contingency management is something that we are known the world over for doing and being effective at experimenting with, showing that it can work in different populations, that it can work in different settings. It can work for virtually any substance that can be misused: alcohol, cigarettes, opioids, methamphetamine, benzodiazepines, cannabis, and a number of other substances. And this is also to show that the evidence is truly overwhelming, even if only accounting for the work that our group has published, which, as great as our group is, there are several other teams examining contingency management as a therapeutic. So this is really the core of what I wanted to get to, which is that this is a technology that we've been working on for some time. And this is sort of the state of the art as it stands right now, is that we have an individual who has a alcohol use disorder. They're interested in receiving treatment. All they need is a phone, reliable internet connection, and a private place. And so what we do is, once they install the app on their phone, and we get a sample of a picture of their face at baseline, so that then subsequently we can use facial recognition technology to verify that it's them before they submit a breath sample, so that we know whether or not they're using alcohol. And if the test is negative, then they get a reinforcer. If the test is positive, then they don't. But they, like I said, they do receive encouragement. And the great thing about this package is that it's portable, right? That it can be delivered virtually anywhere in the world with a couple of key ingredients that I mentioned. And so it requires a breathalyzer, your phone, and that's about it. One other piece that is currently in development I just wanted to mention before moving on is this bit on the left. And I realize this graphic was created for academics and for publishing, so the quality isn't what it should be. This is sort of journal level quality, but hopefully you can at least read on the left there that one thing we are experimenting with is what's called geofencing, and that's being able to detect hot and cold zones for where people might be more likely to relapse. And if we can identify those zones through observation of their drinking behavior for a couple of weeks, where they're just submitting a sample but not receiving a reinforcer in exchange for a negative sample, we're just observing them. That way we can get a sense for where they are most likely to have a relapse, and we can then be able to give them prompts before they enter that area to say, are you sure you want to do this? This could jeopardize your sobriety. You've been making so much progress, kind of an alert for them so that they can then change their behavior. Oh, and I'm sorry, I wanted to also mention up here on the top right, while we're using breath samples currently, we have also began to develop methods of detecting alcohol use and tobacco use as well, using blood spot sampling, which is a relatively simple process. Up there on the right, you can see that red dot on the arm, which is it's a very small device. It's very easy for virtually anyone to do. You take it out of the package, you put it on your arm, you press a button, it takes a very small pinprick sample of blood, and you're asked to ship that back to the research team. And one of the advantages of this is that we can detect alcohol use for up to 30 days. Briefly, I'll just mention that we are expanding this therapeutic to smoking cessation as well. On the right there is the ICO quit meter, which is similar to a breathalyzer for alcohol, but for smoking. We're able to detect expired carbon monoxide samples that people provide, which is evidence of whether or not someone has smoked relatively recently. Same idea, we connect this device to the phone through Bluetooth. People submit samples, and if they're positive, they don't get a voucher, but if they're negative, or excuse me, if they're negative, they do get a voucher. And so we were talking now about how to combine this contingency management piece with medication. We also do a fair amount of experimentation with pharmacotherapy. So we're working right now actually on a couple of projects where we're able to send a package of treatment that includes a prescription for varenicline and usually a first dose, along with a kit with everything that they need in order to initiate a bout of smoking cessation treatment. And then we can monitor them remotely. The last thing I'll mention, I know I'm up against the clock here. I don't want to take time away from my colleagues, but I just wanted to mention briefly that there are a lot of breakthroughs happening in a number of different areas, including genetics. And genetic risk for addiction and potential responses to treatment has become another big facet of the work that we're starting to do. Again, this is something that years ago we couldn't do it so simply, but now with that blood spot testing that I mentioned, we're able to do it pretty readily. And people who have engaged in that report that it's very simple, the instructions are clear, it's not painful, it's nothing to be afraid of. Most people find it very easy to do. And that's another way that we can begin to titrate our treatments that doesn't just benefit people dwelling in urban locations, but benefits people living in rural locations. And then lastly, this addiction neuroclinical assessment framework is a larger framework for understanding addiction and trying to come up with clear therapeutic targets such as incentive salience, emotional dysregulation, and cognitive dysfunction, all of which we can assess remotely. And we hope in time we'll be able to treat them as therapeutic targets for treatment. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll pass it back over to Julie.
Wow, thank you, Sterling. Your research is so relevant and needed. We appreciate all that you've shared with us today. Our final presenter this morning is Dr. Julie Postma, professor in the Department of Nursing and Systems Science and the Associate Dean for Research at WSU's College of Nursing. She has over 15 years of experience working alongside community partners to promote environmental health and justice in Hispanic communities. With the arrival of significant, hazardous, and disruptive wildfire smoke in 2015, her program of research shifted to reducing risks from wildfire smoke exposure on outdoor workers in agricultural communities. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much. Just gonna get my slides up here. Excuse me. All right. Can everyone see my slides? I'm sorry. I'm not seeing you anymore. Can you see my slides? Give me a thumbs up, someone. Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right. So I also, I wanted to share that I had the opportunity to represent WSU Nursing as a National Institute of Health Climate and Health Scholar in the past year. And so I shared some of this work regarding our Hispanic rural population in Washington State and some of the hazards that they face at that national level. And it was a real privilege to represent WSU there. So in the Northwest, we are starting to lose many of the gains that we have made from the Clean Air Act in terms of our air quality. Concentrations of fine particulate matter, a harmful health pollutant, show steady declines through 2016, and then an upward trend, as you can see from this figure. And this is primarily due to wildfire smoke. When we breathe smoke, this fine particulate matter can enter our bloodstream through our lungs and cause an array of health effects. Breathing wildfire smoke can cause chest pain and a rapid heartbeat, respiratory effects like coughing and difficulty breathing, nervous system effects such as fatigue and impaired thinking, and irritation of the mucous membranes, which I'm sure many of you have experienced with your own exposure. Some populations, of course, are at higher risk for exposure, and these include outdoor workers. Outside of the OSHA General Duty Clause, there are no federal laws to protect outdoor workers from wildfire smoke. Why is this important? Well, agricultural workers, of course, work outside, and the work is hard. So it's strenuous and the respiratory rate is higher, and they take in more smoke than many of us working, for example, in an office setting. Our team recently published qualitative findings from 12 Central Washington farm workers who noted two themes of 5, that extreme weather and working conditions are becoming increasingly hazardous to health, and that employers and supervisors lack training and education on health and safety rules. They recommended focusing on the employers and supervisors to ensure safe working conditions. In January of this year, after 2 years of emergency rules, Washington State enacted a permanent occupational health rule to protect outdoor workers from health impacts of wildfire smoke. Employers need to monitor the air quality, communicate smoke hazards to employees, provide information and training about those hazards and preventive approaches, respond to reported symptoms without retaliation, implement exposure controls, and provide respiratory protection at certain thresholds. The purpose of my research in this area was to explore perceptions of the rule elements among agricultural workers, employers, and supervisors. In particular, what I want to talk about with you here today is their reported smoke exposure, health-related symptoms, and training needs per the rule elements. So given the emphasis that workers placed on the role of employers to create healthy workplaces, we decided to survey agricultural employers to explore their perspectives on elements of the smoke rule. We received 128 responses from an online survey distributed through the Ag WeatherNet listserv, and that's a weather station system developed by WSU. Most respondents were white English-speaking men, and most worked with a workforce with fewer than 250 employees. Almost all respondents experienced wildfire smoke at work. 16% reported having hypertension and 11% asthma as chronic health conditions. Respondents reported experiencing the following symptoms after exposure to wildfire smoke at work. Over half reported irritation of mucous membranes, such as eyes, runny nose, things like that. 23% reported headaches or fatigue. 12% reported respiratory symptoms, such as difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, or asthma exacerbations. And 4% reported cardiovascular symptoms, including chest pain, irregular heart rate, or similar. 1/3 of respondents reported that they had not heard of the smoke rule. And again, the timing of this was 2 years, was after 2 years of emergency rules. And let's see, 54% reported having no training on on managing workers with smoke-related symptoms, which is one of the main rule components. And 37% reported having no training on health effects of smoke exposure. Given the limitations of who we reached via this first survey, namely English-speaking employers and managers, and from smaller farms, We collected additional survey from English and Spanish-speaking agricultural supervisors. And these are field supervisors, and they make life and death decisions with their crews on the ground in extreme weather. And it's really what our qualitative research indicated, the folks that we needed to reach out to learn more from. So we collected surveys at agricultural training events in Kennewick and Yakima in December of 23 and January 24, with the team pictured here. These are bilingual colleagues of mine: Sheila Hurst, a clinical track professor; Molly Parker, now a PhD in nursing and alum of our program; and Juliana Romo, who is an undergraduate honors student whose dad works in the hops industry. So we gathered 116 surveys from supervisors, 61% of which were completed in Spanish. And over half of this group worked at rather large workplaces. 80% of respondents in this group have experienced wildfire smoke at work. And similar to the other group, about 18% reported hypertension, 19% reported asthma or respiratory disease. And this was higher than the employers and the managers. Symptoms reported after exposure were similar, with the exception of twice as many people, nearly twice as many, reporting headaches or fatigue. In terms of awareness of the rule and training needs, 1/5 of this sample of respondents reported that they had not heard of the smoke rule. 37% hadn't received training on managing workers with smoke-related symptoms, and 16% had not received training on health effects of wildfire smoke exposure. And of course, these are two major elements of the rule. So in summary, we sampled some hard-to-reach folks, agricultural workers, employers, and field supervisors, to assess their self-reported health conditions, symptoms after exposure to smoke, and health-related training needs in relation to a new occupational wildfire smoke rule in Washington. I should mention, we also asked questions about air quality monitoring and implementing protective controls. The reported smoke exposure is concerning, given the baseline health conditions that workers identified across the spectrum. Over time, awareness of the rule increased, and the respondents reported higher levels of training in identifying health effects of and managing workers with smoke-related symptoms. Findings have been shared with the Department of Labor and Industries, agricultural stakeholders such as the Washington State Tree Fruit Association, local clinics, and advocacy groups to inform outreach and training programs. I want to acknowledge especially Molly Parker, who developed these surveys and largely based her dissertation off of this work, as well as a variety of funding agencies sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's always great to be reminded of these correlations to our health and the impact it can have on all of us. We appreciate your work and the research on this topic. The work all of you are doing on behalf of Washington State University makes us very proud. We're now going to transition into the Q&A portion of our session. We have many questions that have came in during the presentations, so we're going to get right to those. This first question, there's actually two questions that are similar and are directed towards Dr. Stewart. Can you talk about, on one of your slides, you shared the Healthy People 2030, the Rural Healthy People 2030, kind of their 5 national goals. And in that, alcohol use and addiction were separate. And so 2 different questions came in around that, and just want you to have an opportunity to explain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also was a little bit curious and maybe confused at first when I read those about why those were separated out. It's important to remember that drug and alcohol use and misuse and addiction occur on a spectrum. And we recognize that members of our community can suffer adverse consequences of drug and alcohol use without also suffering from addiction. And so if you think about it, interventions might be very, very different depending on what your target is. So if your goal is to decrease underage drug and alcohol use, the intervention you would study could be very, very different than the intervention you would use to study effects of new treatments for somebody that is actually diagnosed with a substance use disorder and has dependence or addiction. So it makes sense to separate those out because the targets, the populations and the potential interventions could be very different.
Great, thank you for that. And while you're unmuted, I'll ask another question that came in for you, really focused on polypharmacy. So many patients have multiple different providers that are prescribing depending on the condition they're seen for. How does a pharmacist really manage those multiple prescriptions coming in from multiple providers?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it really can be used to highlight the potential adverse consequences of those pharmacy deserts. So your pharmacist is keeping a medical record, similar to, but often separate from the medical records that your primary care providers are keeping. And within that medical record, they list out and they highlight what chronic conditions you have, the medications you take, your history with those medications, if you had any adverse reactions to a medication or allergies and all. And those computer systems are smart systems. They have what we call clinical decision support, which helps screen for drug and disease state interactions. And so this really highlights the importance of having a primary pharmacist where that maintains your medical records and where you go to receive your medications, so that extra step in screening for those potential interactions can be completed. You want your pharmacist to have that full list of medications that you're on and understand your pharmacy history really, really well.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Next question for Dr. McPherson. Somebody asked about consideration of using oral swabs for testing and referenced a bill that was introduced last session around swabs specifically for DUI.
Yeah, thank you for that question. From a research and therapeutic point of view, we have not experimented with swabs. We have looked at that as something that we'd be interested in. We have intentionally designed our technology to be sample agnostic. So the goal is that this app would be able to pair with any device where you can provide an objective evidence of whether or not a person has recently used. I'm not aware of any technology that allows those swabs to become instantly available for research purposes yet. If that is the case, that's certainly something that we would want to experiment with. A quick note on that is that there's also developing technologies for a similar test, but for methamphetamine. And there's been tests for testing sweat for methamphetamine as well. The problem is being able to make those portable, easy for a person to do, easy to submit the sample. And I don't think we're there yet for some of these tests, but certainly the hope is that we'd be able to use any test that can provide immediate results and then provide a way of giving those results to the clinician or the researcher so they can provide a reinforcer.
Excellent, thank you. For Julie Postma, can you explain to us how clinics and providers in those rural communities, how can they help support worker health?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a really important consideration. I am part of a farm worker coalition, and part of the impetus for that coalition was working with community health workers, or promotores, in some of these communities to better understand their role in serving workers and promoting their health. And so I am learning from them some of the issues, including the profound increase in the number of guest workers, the H-2A visa guest worker program, and the fact that community health workers are helping train those workers, onboarding them by the thousands in these rural communities when harvest, or when the season starts. And so I would point to this, this particular kind of allied workforce within these often federally qualified health clinics in our rural Washington counties as important people to think about and a workforce to train to promote worker health. So a couple of the areas that they are currently teaching guest workers about are oral health and sexual health. And I would certainly add some of these occupational exposures to that list, including heat stress, which we didn't talk about, but is another huge related climate and health risk, and wildfire smoke. Those both hit at the same time, which is particularly problematic. So we often think about our nurse practitioners and our primary care docs, our pharmacists, but there's another group in there, community health workers or promotores, that are cultural liaisons to this important subpopulation in Washington State.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, let me just see here, that came in for Dr. McPherson, really focused on recruiting in rural areas. How did you recruit in rural, and what challenges did you see from that?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So we are fortunate to be able to have good relationships with a number of clinics around the state. We're just one of several other groups that do work on addiction science and development of remote therapeutics. So we have a network of, right now, I think roughly 30 clinics. We send a newsletter to them. We always ask them to tell us what are some of the questions that you have for us that we could maybe answer through research. And not all of those are rural, obviously. Several of them are. And so we try to recruit just because of the relationships that we have with the clinics, and because they have been very generous with their time and being willing to help us do research with them. And then another way that we recruit them is actually through targeted social media. We use similar technology that other people use for ads to sell you things to recruit participants. And that's been quite effective. And actually, that's something we started post-pandemic. And it's something that we quickly realized that for people who were seeking treatment for alcohol and substance use, it had the ability to reach a lot of people, including people in rural locations that had previously not been reached. And they've expressed, many participants have expressed a lot of thanks for hearing about this. And they were surprised that this was a research study that they could participate in, even though they live in some of these far-flung places and had struggled to be able to identify a treatment center that was close enough to be able to be feasible to them, to have transportation and all the other things that come with going to treatment fairly routinely. So those are the ways that we've been able to reach rural participants.
Great. And I know that we have had a few questions that really focused on, looking at that rural map, recognizing that some of our Indigenous reservations fall into those areas. And so I know Dr. Stewart supplied a response that I believe is being moved over to the chat, but I would love for all three of you to just take a moment and speak to how, or if you are in your research partnering with Indigenous reservations or tribal nations. We can start with Dr. Stewart.
Yeah, and absolutely, we would be inclusive of our tribal partners in the work of our Rural Health Initiative. And in order to ensure that we are set up to do that, we actually have a pharmacist on our advisory council that identifies as Native American and provides that representation. We're also really, really fortunate to be able to access all the resources at Native American Health Sciences at WSU and to get us going there. So I think, yeah, so the answer is yes. And we look forward to opportunities to help address the needs of those communities through advancing pharmacy care.
And Dr. Postma, how about with your research and the kind of that overlapping with, say, like the Yakima Tribal Nation and others that are in the area where you would do research?
Yes, I have not worked with Indigenous partners in this program of research. It has largely been Hispanic, Mexican-born community partners. I would say we have so much to learn. I'm thinking in particular of the upstream factors that influence wildfire smoke in terms of prescribed burning and land management approaches. So that is not a nursing focal area, but of course is really important to consider. From sort of my work broadly, there are certainly risk communication and other sorts of tools coming out of the Colville, Confederated Tribes of Colville, for example. They've been dealing with this for a very long time. So important group, not a group I work with directly, but thanks for the question.
Yeah. And Sterling, I'll give you an opportunity to speak to that. And then if you also could answer a question that came in through the chat, and I believe a formal response is going to be moved into the YouTube chat, but talking about the potential of continuous glucose monitoring, and as new technologies are coming about, how can those be transferred over into the research that you're doing?
So I want to make sure that I'm hitting both of those in order. The first question is, the short answer is yes. We have modified some of these approaches to delivering contingency management in rural locations specifically for American Indian populations. We completed a trial 4 or 5 years ago in rural Montana where we delivered, well, there was 2 steps. The first step is working with the community, collecting focus group data and finding out what works for them, which was enormously informative. I should say I am not an expert in qualitative data collection and analysis, but I get to work with people who are much smarter and more talented than me, who I'm able to collaborate with and work collaboratively so that they can collect and analyze that focus group data, and we can work on how does our treatment need to be modified for that specific community. And one example of that is the types of prizes that individuals would get in exchange for a negative sample. They had very specific requests in this community for things that would be reinforcing for them. So that initial step of qualitative data collection proved critical. And so anyway, that trial was completed and it was targeting alcohol use and another addiction. So it was actually a study where we targeted 2 substances because that's what the community asked for with the same therapeutic contingency management. And that work has since been published. And we've done a similar, I won't get into the specifics, but we have done a similar study focused on smoking cessation for American Indian communities. And then the second question on continuous glucose monitoring. I am not an expert in this, but I work with Dr. Naomi Chater in medicine, who is an expert on glucose monitoring and cognitive function, actually. I just attended a great talk by her just the other day. So is it possible to monitor glucose remotely? The answer is yes, but I don't know whether or not that has been combined with any kind of contingency management procedure. With something like that and similar to like HIV medication adherence, I think a concern is often that the consequences of not providing a reinforcer could have substantial consequences for someone who needs to monitor their glucose. And, you know, do we withhold a reinforcer when they are not adherent to the way that they're supposed to be managing their glucose? I think has some ethical things that we need to work through, but that is something that's been discussed in the literature.
Great, thank you. And one last question for Julie. As you're recruiting people into your research, do you run into any issues where we've seen distrust of just research in general from certain populations, as well as potentially distrust of technology that you might be implementing as part of your research? How does that play into that, and how do you overcome that to recruit into your research?
Sure, thanks for that question. We work really closely with community partners, including Mary Jo Ibarra-Vega from the Quincy Community Health Clinic. So along with her and some other members of the Farm Worker Coalition, all of my work is kind of under that umbrella. So it has been pretty accepted. We've been able to recruit the number of people that we've wanted. That said, we're not reaching a lot of people in that, one survey was online and in English. The second survey captured the population we wanted in terms of supervisors. But of course, as Juliana, our undergrad honors student, mentioned, her dad wasn't at those trainings. There's a lot of people that are not sent to a Washington State Tree Fruit Association training, for example. And what was the second part of that? Was recruitment and
just overcoming that potentially perceived distrust of having their information and research. And
yeah, I would say also the dissemination plan is coordinated with partners in that farm worker coalition. So we have partners reviewing our manuscripts or our infographics, things like that, to make sure that we maintain accountability to the population that we're serving and are sensitive in terms of language. The other part I forgot to address was technology. We did look at doing some sampling with like farm workers, for example, wearing wristbands that would capture smoke exposure, but they really pointed us to focusing on supervisors and the employers and not them. So we take those considerations very seriously, and that did inform the next step of our research. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Well, it looks like we are just about out of time, so that wraps things up for us this morning. Want to please join me in giving a big virtual round of applause to our speakers and researchers, Dr. Stuart McPherson and Postma. Thank you so much. We really, truly do genuinely appreciate your time this morning and your insight. I feel very privileged, and I'm assuming everyone else watching on YouTube does as well, to just hear about the work and the first-class research you're doing, and the research that's coming out of Washington State University that not only impacts our area, but our state and our world. We also want to give another shout out to our sponsor, Alaska Airlines. Alaska is a very proud partner of all things WSU. We're privileged that we have them as a sponsor for our Wake Up with Research series. We do look forward to seeing you all again in 2025. We're planning another event in either February or March, so watch for more information in your inbox as those details come about. You can always find out more about these events and others on our WSU Spokane website at spokane.wsu.edu. And we will be posting a recording of today's Wake Up with Research session on that website on the Wake Up with Research page. If you would like to follow up on anything that was shared today, please feel free to reach out to me. I can point you in the right direction. Also, if you or your business is interested in sponsoring one of our upcoming series, please reach out to us. Again, big thank you to our presenters today and to you, our guests. We look forward to seeing you again and appreciate your support in being with us. Have a wonderful day, stay healthy, safe, and as always, go Cougs.